In this video, I'm going to start the Anglo-Saxon model, and this is one of the three capitalist models we're going to build in the course, the other two being the European model and the Asian model. The term Anglo-Saxon goes back to Germanic inhabitants of the territory of Great Britain from the 5th to 11th century. The Anglo-Saxon model is best represented today by these countries: the US, the UK, Switzerland, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and Australia. All these countries have in common primarily free market enterprise and democracy in government. There's also a social system that is more free, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, things like that. So you'll recognize the Anglo-Saxon model as the typical kind of environment that we live in today. It's historically Great Britain and the United States. We're going to go back to Great Britain prior to the Industrial Revolution and see how the seeds were planted for that revolution to come and ultimately to the free economy that they have today. And for the United States, the U.S. came later. Obviously, we fought a Revolutionary War to extricate ourselves from the Brits back in 1776. And after that period, we became an even more Anglo type system. For most of the US's existence, you could say that we were the freest market economy in the world. Of course, that has changed in modern time, but historically, the US stands out as probably the most authentic representation of the Anglo-Saxon capitalist model. The philosophical origins, John Locke and Adam Smith. To understand the Anglo-Saxon model, let's go back to England before the Industrial Revolution and look at three areas of the system. You had agriculture and manufacturing. Those were the two primary industries. And then you had feudal government, which is primarily a kingdom where you have a lot of power consolidated in the hands of very few or even one person. So talk about feudal agriculture. Agriculture back then was done on large plots of land where there was really no private property rights. This is a highly inefficient system because you get what's known as a tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is when people don't own property, they see all the benefits of taking stuff from that property, but they don't see the costs. It's like the costs are transferred to society as a whole. Today, for example, with the rainforest, you have people that go in and they take all these beautiful trees out of the forest, and they consider the benefits, right? They get the tree, but they don't think of the costs. The costs go to third parties or to society as a whole. So that tragedy of the commons is still with us today. But back then it was a bigger issue because private property rights were not common. So what does this do? Well, it creates an enclosure system. The evolution towards enclosure is really one step towards private property rights. Enclosure is just saying land that was previously tilled in open fields would be assigned to specific users. So maybe those users would be more efficient. They would consider, hey, this is my field. I need to think of the benefits and I need to think of the costs, and that would bring down a lot of these tragedy of the common inefficiencies. This laid the foundation for private property rights, which are a cornerstone of a capitalist system. Then you've got feudal manufacturing. Feudal manufacturing was all about cottage industries, people working in their home or in small assemblies in the village, craftsmen, artisans. There is a certain charm to this kind of production. We often look back at history and kind of celebrate the simplicity of this era, but that simplicity was inefficient, at least compared to what would eventually become a manufacturing industrial complex. You also have the problem of these small villages and people monopolizing. I mean, monopolies are easier to form in small communities than bigger communities because clearly there's less competition in a small village than there would be in an entire country, for example. And sometimes people forget that. They think, well, monopolies are a global thing, but monopolies are oftentimes a much more localized thing. You'll see the ultimate power of a monopoly when you drive across the desert and there's that one mom and pop gas station with no competition. They've got much more power than Walmart and Amazon combined. But what happens in these small feudal kind of villages is the workers, the artisans, the merchants, they get together and they start to control their industry. They set norms, standards, they create trademarks, having so much power that you can actually say, no one else can use my brand, my name, my idea. So this is a movement towards intellectual property rights that do restrict competition, but as we're going to see, also have an upside because people are going to be much more likely to come up with new ideas in an environment where there are these protections. Often possessed monopoly and regulatory power. These craft guilds, these kind of village monopolies, they were getting intertwined with government. Many of the leaders of the craft guilds would run for office, or they would have political influence in other ways. And so they were able to get the government to give them more influence. And this is nothing new. I mean, think about who sets the norms and the standards in the medical industry. Well, the American Medical Association, a private organization of doctors, a craft guild, in essence, has a lot of control over the kinds of laws that come about in that industry. But in feudal manufacturing, we have a lot of inefficiencies that are going to be improved upon with the Industrial Revolution. We also have the beginning of these kinds of government interventions that are going to be a double-edged sword. They're going to provide protection for intellectual property rights that will incentivize people to produce more, will incentivize more entrepreneurship and more innovation, but it will also come with less competition and the potential for even more monopolization later on with even bigger companies. Finally, feudal government. Back in this pre-industrial revolution, we have a government that's focused a lot on mercantilism. That is, going around the world, getting resources from other areas, colonization, that type of thing. They are involved in the community, mainly to the extent of poor laws. There's always been an issue of poverty and still is across the world today. So the idea of having a welfare state, a government providing assistance to people, is nothing new. In fact, you think about it from a noble standpoint, you say, well, government wants to help poor people. Okay, that's possible. Maybe you have benevolent people in government. But it's also possible and very likely that by having poor laws, by protecting the poor, you are preventing civil unrest. I mean, people that have nothing to lose are often the ones that are most likely to undertake a revolution. And poor laws are a way of squashing that before it gets any traction. So overall, we're creating the foundation for this revolution. Private property rights, having protections for intellectual property, incentivizing new innovation and ideas, creating more integration of the private sector and government, giving the businessmen and women more influence over the institutions that manage them, that control them, and also creating a more stable kind of environment by protecting the poor. And all of this comes together to create a fertile ground for industrial revolution. An even greater change came with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This transferred power from the king to parliament. This movement away from a king, autocratic kind of government to a representative democracy, parliament, lowered the tax burden, it reduced government appropriation, and limited the growth of government. All ingredients of creating an industrial revolution. The English Bill of Rights in 1689 took this to another level. It brought about freedom from royal interference in the law. That creates a more stable legal environment, more consistency in the law, as opposed to the legal system being at the discretion and whims of an almighty king. It brought about freedom to petition, freedom of speech, right to bear arms. I mean, you recognize a lot of this stuff because this is what we have in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Another factor that helped move towards industrial revolution is the formation of the corporation. So a corporation is just an assembly of people that come together to start a business under that particular type model. And the Joint Stock Company Act of 1844 allowed for individuals to come together and form a corporation without royal approval. So that opens the door to more corporations in the business world. And then the Joint Stock Company Act of 1856 allowed for limited liability of those owners. That's even more important because The limited liability means that whatever money you put into the corporation, that's all you can lose. You can never have your personal assets taken from you to satisfy the debts and obligations of the corporation, which means that a lot more people are going to want to go and open or start businesses, and a lot more people are going to want to invest in businesses knowing that their liability is limited to that which they put into the business. And then finally, 1897, we get legal personhood. This is where the corporation becomes a legal person, completely separating it from its owners and allowing the corporation to sign contracts and to do business in its own name. There are very few things that are more important to having a growing industrial economy than the formation of a corporation. Simply put, you would not have the amount of savings flowing into the business world if it weren't for this limited liability and separation of the owners from the business itself. The English Industrial Revolution began in the late 18th century and brought about sustained growth in GDP and GDP per capita. Sustained is an important term here because while there have been pockets of growth in historical societies, the Roman Empire, the Grecian Empire, Persian Empire, things like that, it was hard to sustain this growth over the long periods. And growth in GDP per capita is important because that increases the standard of living for people. So these are two very positive things that come about from the Industrial Revolution. So it spread across Europe and the European offshoots. And you say, well, why did it spread? Because it was working. It was enhancing the standard of living of people and allowing for a brighter future. That being said, this guy, Walter Rostow, an economist, analyzed this kind of industrialization. And it's similar to what Marx did. It's just he's got a different theory of history. Traditional society is going back the longest time. And then he goes to the preconditions for takeoff. For him, that includes some of the things we talked about, like the formation of a corporation and private property rights. But beyond that, you need to have, in his view, secular education. You need a transportation infrastructure so people can get around and move, not just themselves, but goods and equipment. You need a middle class from which to draw entrepreneurs. Middle class people are those that have satisfied their basic needs, so they are more likely to have the extra savings to fund the investment in capital equipment to create the businesses of the future. And keep in mind that when we have an industrial revolution, you're not talking about starting businesses as an artisan or a craftsman. Home-based type businesses that require very little equipment, where you've got labor-intensive production. We're talking about capital-intensive production. So the fixed cost of starting a business is much higher. And that means you got to have a class of people that has that savings and that ability to go into those businesses, or at the very least, funnel that money through a stable banking system into corporations so that the corporation can then get that equipment and grow. If those preconditions are met, then he believes you will take off into sustained growth. And you'll get the following signals. You'll get a revolution in capital formation, doubling or even more of the investment rate, and you'll get rapid industrialization. So these will be the signs that you've now moved into a new era of economics. You've moved into a new system. And we can look at history and see that, yeah, that's exactly what happened in England and later on in the US and today in India and China. There is, however, a drive to maturity. That means that there's only so long you can go with sustained growth by industrialization. At some point, you get diminishing returns and you just can't move the economy forward. It's kind of the old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? If you keep adding cooks to a fixed amount of ovens, each cook produces less and less and less until you can't get any more output from an additional cook. If you keep adding a whole lot of ovens to a fixed amount of cooks, then the same thing happens. You end up getting diminishing returns. So capital economies, every industrial revolutions are just that. They're adding more equipment, more ovens, and eventually they just can't get any more from that particular resource. So there's that drive to maturity. There's the age of high mass consumption. If you look at the US, for example, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were in our industrial revolution. We had the preconditions for takeoff and we're moving towards sustained growth. But then that continued through World War II, and we get this drive to maturity. And after World War II, we start to see the age of high mass consumption, which has continued ever since. So this is very consistent with the history that we've seen in our own country, and it's probably a result of the high levels of productivity that come from industrialization lead to the ability to consume a lot. So it's a byproduct of enhanced GDP. All right, that's it. I'll pick up in the next